Oh, I'm gonna die. I'm not your witness, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
This is interesting. And I was curious if, let me read it first. You're quoting. This is a quote, and I like how you just quote it and then tell people where it's from. Keep women silent at church. They are not permitted to speak. Command them to be obedient according to the law. If they want to learn something, they will wait and ask their husbands at home, because it is a shame for women to speak in church. And then you quote a passage. This is erroneous. Now, the quote is correct. This is in the Bible. You're absolutely right. But you gave the wrong verse. There is a verse. So you quote you cite 1 Corinthians 14:34, which
that is wrong.
That is a sexist verse. So you weren't entirely wrong.
There's Timothy. It was Timothy or Titus.
Correct.
I think.
It's 1 Timothy 2:12.
Damn it!
And I just noticed there is a whole Wikipedia article just on this verse. So go to Wikipedia 1 Timothy 2:12. It contains a lot of Christian apologetics and stuff, but it has also the valid points in it as well. No, this is real. Now there are problems with this. I mean, one is Paul didn't write it; it's a forgery.
Timothy is a definite agreed upon that it's epigraph.
Even 1 Corinthians 14:34, there's strong evidence that Paul didn't write that either. That's an interpolation, and this is one of the ones that I talk about in my book Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. I have a whole chapter on interpolations in Paul that we can infer without manuscript evidence, and there are particular reasons why we can't expect there to be manuscript evidence of all interpolations. So sometimes we have good evidence that they were fake, that someone put them in. But anyway, for people who want to get into 1 Corinthians 14:34, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, I have a chapter on it. But it also has, that verse also depicts Paul telling women to shut up, basically. Women shouldn't speak in church, which is, I think, a post-Timothy interpolation into 1 Corinthians, because elsewhere Paul is very big on women speaking in church. But it was within 100 years of Paul, Christians didn't like that anymore. So they started forging letters by Paul denouncing women speaking in church to try and keep women in their place. And the effect is women were shut out of education. Women could not teach anymore under Christian authority for almost 2,000 years, right? And so it was a really long time until women were allowed to teach again, women were allowed to authority again. Women didn't even have the vote in the US until 1920, right? So that's how impactful this Bible verse has been in suppressing women's rights. So it is absolutely valid to point this out, that this is, even though it's a forgery, we only know that now, and fundamentalist Christians deny it anyway. So
you're
it doesn't
saying
matter.
First and Second Corinthians are interpolations?
No, just this verse, 1 Corinthians 14:34, which we have not quoted to the audience right now. Let me get it, because we're talking about your.
While you're looking that up, I will say that I think Paul, unless it's not genuine, he did. Two of the churches that he visited were run by females, Priscilla and Phoebe.
I mean, that's possible. The source for that is not reliable. But we have references to a female apostle, supposedly, Junia. Now, there's some dispute as to whether that is a female or a male name. But in the Bible, it is they come with what do you call them?
Gloss, footnotes.
No. I'm trying to think of a grammar term, and my brain is denying me. Definite articles. So they come with definite articles that tell you the gender of the person, and I think all manuscripts have it, or at least all early manuscripts have the article as feminine, which means the authors who were copying it, whether it was intentional by Paul originally or not, the authors copying it believed that it was a woman. So yeah, according to Paul's authentic writings, there was even an apostle, which is one of the, Paul says, is the highest rank in the church that you could hold at the time, which is apostle. That there was at least one woman who was an apostle. Bible Gateway.
I think I paraphrased this, actually, because I don't think it says exactly what I put.
It says roughly that. Here, I'll quote Bible translation. So first of all, let's do, you cite 1 Corinthians 14:34. Here is what that passage says. That says, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their. Oh, wait a minute. They should ask their own husbands at home. Okay, so no, wait, hold on.
Dude, I nailed it. That's
I've been
exactly
doing
what
this
okay.
wrong. So this is the verse. Hold on. There's something hinky about this.
But what's the one in there? I know there's one in Timothy also, or at least one. There's probably more.
Yeah. Hold on. No, it's First Timothy. Wait.
Oh, there's something about praying in
confused.
public. That doesn't have to do with females. That has to
Yeah, that's right.
go in the closet and pray.
Here we go. It's 11 to 15. It is one of the most misogynistic passages in the Bible. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women, they'll be saved through childbirth if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Meaning, shut up and have babies, and that's how you'll be saved. So that is literally the most misogynistic verse in the whole Bible.
Although that's not genuine, we know that. But
yeah, that's a forgery.
Even if that didn't come from Paul, Paul's still not off the hook because of Philemon, and everyone wants to cite the cases, the anti-slavery cases where he tries to,
it's not anti-slavery though.
No, it's the exact opposite. He's trying to get him back to his master.
Yeah, there's literally no anti-slavery passage anywhere in the Old or New Testament, like none.
Yep.
So there are other verses in 1 Corinthians where Paul is talking about authorizing women to speak in church. So there's some manuscript evidence to suggest that this is an interpolation. Someone added this, probably inspired by the Timothy forgery. So after Timothy was forged, someone inserted a verse into 1 Corinthians to sort of correct it, to make it say what they want Paul to have said. But this is not relevant to your point, which is that modern Christians, for the longest time, for most of Christianity, believed that this was the word of God, right? So like, it doesn't matter that we now know that it's a forgery. Even fundamentalist Christians deny that it's a forgery. They think it's an authorized word of God. It's the literal, inerrant word of God. Even this passage in 1 Corinthians, even the passage in 1 Timothy. So this is real. Like, this is a real example of the fundamental misogyny at the heart of Christian scriptures. Liberal Christians have a good out. We know it's a forgery. We don't follow that anymore. Or, they can even accept that this is an interpolation in 1 Corinthians and say, "Oh, we don't agree with that anymore." But of course, as soon as they start doing that, now you're saying, "Well, how do you trust any of it, right? Like, why are you picking and choosing? How do you pick and choose?" That's a valid criticism of liberal Christianity. And I have a whole article on that. What's the Harm? My article I go into what's wrong with conservative Christianity, but then I add, like, liberal Christianity is not off the hook either, but it is a far sight better than conservative Christianity, because conservatives still think this verse is the word of God, still to this day.
There are 13 epistles, letters to the early Christian church, in the Bible that were allegedly authored by Paul. At least 6 of these are known forgeries. It is widely believed by biblical scholars that Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon are the only authentic Pauline epistles. The rest have been judged pseudo-apocryphal, which means written by some other unknown author under Paul's name. And this comes to us from, this is the judgment of the Blackwell Companion to the New Testament, which is a very well-respected document. So this actually, for me, back when I was a Christian, back when I first started kind of studying the Bible in earnest as a body of work, as a work of literature, as something more than just a devotional text, something more than just the sacred and holy Word of God, I started looking into, some of the academic things that have been published about the Bible, and this was one of the first things that I encountered, which frankly surprised me. The idea that there are books that are ascribed to Paul or traditionally thought of as being by Paul even if they're not explicitly stated as being written by Paul, that anybody would take that into question, right? And say, wait a minute, are we sure that this actually came from Paul? And how would you know, right? And so the idea of studying one letter versus another letter, right? So like First Thessalonians versus Second Thessalonians, for example. And I won't get into the details. I'm not a biblical scholar. If you are interested in looking up, more about Pauline authorship of the various epistles in the New Testament, please go ahead and do so. But for me, it was just a shock to realize that there's kind of a consensus, right? So Jim points out that yes, this is the view of most biblical scholars. I will point out that it does seem to be the case that the more fundamentalist you are as a biblical scholar, and there are fundamentalist Christians who have gone into academics, and surprisingly enough, their academic opinions, mirror their fundamentalist beliefs to a significant degree. So generally speaking, if you are encountering very fundamentalist biblical scholars who are commenting on Pauline authorship, they tend to say, yeah, he wrote all of them. So our conclusion as academics is completely in line with what the church has always taught, surprisingly enough. At any rate, the mainstream scholarship, right? So we're taking into account people who are, people who are Christian, but maybe not fundamentalist Christian, as well as certainly secular scholars such as Bart Ehrman and many, many others. There are fortunately more secular scholars of the Bible as the years go on. At one point in time, it was mostly dominated by fundamentalists. And actually, this is just an aside, the more liberal scholarship of the Bible and the analysis of the Bible, including things like Pauline authorship, is actually what led to actually explicit fundamentalism in the first place. So a lot of these, the scholars that were doing this sort of criticism of the Bible, exploring it, analyzing it, asking deep questions about how do we know that this person authored this and not this, that was happening over 100 years ago. This was in Europe, where most of the academic study of the Bible was taking place in the 19th century. It was fairly commonplace for these ideas to be advanced and discussed and gain traction, and the arguments to be made and be found persuasive. And this is really what led to what we consider now today to be kind of liberal theology, or a liberal approach to Christianity that says, all right, well, look, everything that is presented to us can be taken at face value, right? So that's not necessarily the case anymore. The development of liberal theology said, wait a minute, let's look deeper than just what's at face value. How did this even come to be? What can we know about this? Is this even good for anybody? So those sorts of questions became part of the whole enterprise. And it had a radical effect on the way that Christianity was taken. And a lot of people, especially here in the United States, a lot of people reacted very negatively to that, especially basically Christian lay people who had always been raised with a very kind of superficial understanding of Christianity, and did not really appreciate how the development of these other understandings or other interpretations of their religion were sort of making their way into the seminaries, frankly. So Harvard Seminary, Yale Seminary, they didn't like that those were becoming places where liberal ideas about Christianity could take place, including discussions about the Pauline authorship of the New Testament epistles, right? And so that, coupled with what happened at the same time, the development of evolution, right? And the Darwin's theory of evolution was published about the same time, and again, had a little bit of a struggle initially with the church, but within the secular scholarship became pretty well accepted in Europe and came over into the United States as well, and also started to be pretty well accepted within the sort of, high-level seminary scholars within the church. And so the evolution, the idea that, well, my grandfather wasn't no monkey, that combined with, are you saying that Paul didn't write 2 Thessalonians? How dare you? That was just too much, I think, for the average American believer to really come to grips with. And the reaction to that was fundamentalism. So there's a movement that took place in the very early part of the 20th century that resulted in a publication of a series of books called The Fundamentals of the Faith. And that gave rise to fundamentalism specifically, right? And it laid out very explicitly what they were objecting to. And it was stuff like this that they were objecting to. They did not want this in their sort of old-time religion. They wanted a very superficial, face value interpretation of the Bible as literally true, right? Word for word. If the King James Bible is good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, right? So that fundamentalism then, in America at least, took over most of the 20th century and sort of set the tone, I think, for Christian culture, or at least the dominant Christian culture. Certainly as it evolved into evangelicalism, which was basically, evangelicalism is basically fundamentalism with a bullhorn, right? So fundamentalism that's going out doing preaching in baseball stadiums and stuff like that. The big revivals, the Billy Graham sort of thing. That's basically fundamentalism writ large, and so that percolated into most of mainstream Christianity at the time. Certainly, it influenced me. I don't know that I would have considered myself even like an evangelical or a fundamentalist, certainly at the time, but these letters, Paul's letters, were always presented to me as from Paul, and there was never a question. So just the idea of encountering these when I was a young Christian, and encountering the idea that, well, some of these might not actually have been written by Paul. They might have been written by somebody else who thought, well, I'm going to build, so I've got this other letter by Paul, let's say Thessalonians. I've got this letter, and I'm going to take these themes and I'm going to develop them a little bit further. And then in order to give them credence, in order to make people think that they should take this seriously, I'm going to say that this is from Paul. And so the 6 epistles that are really called into question as being pretty clearly inauthentically Pauline: Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, obviously, as we mentioned, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Hebrews. And some of these, like Ephesians starts off saying this is from Paul, right? So the way that Ephesians is written, whoever put that together, the way that we have it handed down, whoever wrote it and put Paul's name at the front. But the analysis of the entire work shows that it's not Pauline. Hebrews doesn't say who wrote it at all. Traditionally, it was thought to be from Paul, but even in the very early days of the church, they knew that this was a question. And in fact, there's a passage from one of the church fathers, Origen, a church father from Alexandria, who commented on Hebrews, and he says this. He says that the character of the diction of the epistle entitled to the Hebrews has not the apostle's rudeness in speech, who confessed himself rude in speech, that is, in style, but that the epistle is better Greek than the framing of its diction, will be admitted by everyone who is able to discern differences of style. So he's saying, stylistically, this doesn't seem consistent with Paul's other writings. But again, on the other hand, that the thoughts of the epistle are admirable and not inferior to the acknowledged writings of the apostle. To this also everyone will consent as true who has given attention to reading the apostle. So he's saying, well, even if it doesn't seem like Paul wrote it, it's at least as good as anything else that he wrote. Which, okay, fine. But as for myself, Origen says, if I were to state my own opinion, I should say that the thoughts are the apostles', but that the style and composition belong to one who called to mind the apostles' teachings and, as it were, made short notes of what his master said. So what Origen is saying is, I don't think Paul actually wrote this, but I think whoever did was either familiar with Paul personally or familiar with other things that Paul had written. which, yeah, I mean, that's what scholars believe now, probably. It was probably one of those two things, either somebody that knew Paul or somebody that was just familiar with his writings and his ideas and his arguments and was able to put the same sort of thoughts together. But, different people write different ways, and so it's very obvious that somebody different is writing this. So Origen goes on to say, if any church therefore holds this epistle as Paul's, let it be commended for this also. For not without reason have the men of old handed it down as Paul's. But who wrote the epistle, in truth God knows, which means nobody knows. Yet the account which has reached us, some saying that Clement, who was bishop of the Romans, wrote the epistle, others that it was Luke, he who wrote the gospel and the Acts. So he's saying, look, I don't really know who wrote it. I've heard that it might have been Clement, who was another church father. I've also heard that maybe the writer of Luke and Acts, whoever that was, whether it was actually Luke, that they would have written it. Again, who knows? But he's summing up by saying, look, there's a reason why people have ascribed it to Paul, and the reason is because it is consistent with other things that he said. So I don't have a problem with people keeping this in their churches and reading it during worship, but just know be honest with it and be truthful about that. We just don't know. So that's what Origen has to say. Unfortunately, Origen's opinion about that didn't filter through to the 20th century Christianity that I was familiar with, and so for me it was a total surprise and shock to learn that that some of these epistles that Paul had ostensibly written had not actually been written by Paul. So make of that what you will.